Welcome back, everyone. This is the Book of the Covenant, returned after our Shavuos and post-Memorial Day break. We are here for the next 3 weeks, June 15th, June 22nd, and June 29th, to continue learning where I picked off, learning in Mishpatim with Rabbi David Silber. It's been a pleasure to have Rabbi David Silber teaching. He is the dean and founder at Drisha. And with that, I'm going to hand things over to him.
Okay, thank you. So yes, I just did decide to extend the sessions to 3 more sessions just to touch upon some more of the content of Mishpatim, which the Torah refers to in chapter 24, the Book of the Covenant. So I'm glad we have a chance to meet. These are obviously very difficult times for the Jewish people. Israel is under attack, and there's a war going on, and of course our thoughts are with them, and we certainly pray for the best. Hopefully that things will turn out at the end okay, and we'll be in a better situation. But it's hard to, our thoughts are certainly with our brothers and sisters in Israel. Okay, I just wanted to address in these 3 sessions some of the core issues that are raised by the section that we Mishpatim, or what the Torah calls in chapter 24, the Book of the Covenant, Sefer HaBrit. Some of this we touched upon earlier. I just wanted to go over some things and add a few more details. This set of laws that we have over here really begins with the 10 Commandments in chapter 20. People say to Moshe, we don't want to hear God's voice anymore. You speak to us instead. Moshe and God agree. And at the end of chapter 20, we have some additional laws, which we spoke about, which are actually seem to be very much related to the first of the Dibrot. Don't make any molten idols, gold and silver idols. There are laws about the altar, etc. And then in chapter 21, these are the mishpatim, the rules that you should place before them. Now I want to come back to that verse either later today or next week. And the word that is interesting is lifneihem, before them. Who is the them? And that's a very important question that we will hope to deal with. But these laws, these mishpatim, it's a set of rules. And the point is, as we know, the Torah largely is a story. So the first 4 books of the Torah are a story about our patriarchs and matriarchs in the book of Bereshit, the story of the creation of Israel as a people in the next 3 books. It's a story, but interspersed in this story, there are sections of laws. There's one big section over here in Shemot, beginning in end of chapter 20 through chapter 23 inclusive. There are the laws that we find in the book of Vayikra, Parshat Kedoshim. There are many laws, but there's a whole set of laws in Kedoshim, chapter 19, etc. Really begins before that. And then we have in the book of Devarim, which is a whole other kind of book, where we have a very extensive set of laws. Half the book is about these laws and rules that Moshe instructs the people in the last year of his life. So we have these different groups of laws. Now, the first thing that we notice about these groups of laws, when you think about, I mentioned 3 of them, the 3 main ones of the Torah. And one thing that is striking is that none of these groups of laws can be seen as a full law code. When you look at the 3 different groups, you recognize immediately that each of them is quite incomplete. In other words, let's take, for example, Mishpatim that we've been looking at. There are, chapter 21, 22, 23, there are many rules, but there are also many things that are not there. And you would expect in the code that these things would be there. For example, there's more than one example. I'll pick up one obvious example. Laws about relating to marriage, divorce, all kinds of other laws that relate to relationship of husband and wife, etc. They're not there. Now, in contrast, when you look at Sefer Devarim, the laws over there there's a very extended section about precisely these things: marriage, divorce, all kinds of questions about the marriage, etc. That all comes up in Sefer Devarim, and is conspicuously absent in our section of law. Another example, inheritance. Inheritance is not mentioned in Mishpatim. Seems like a pretty basic issue. It comes up in Sefer Devarim, where the Torah says if a man has two wives, you can't give, and there's an older child and a younger child, you can't favor the wife, the younger child of the more beloved wife. A rule that, of course, seems to relate very much to the stories in Sefer Bereshit of Yaakov and his sons, etc., Reuven and Yosef, etc. They have laws of inheritance. Not just that, we also have stories about inheritance. We have two stories in the Chumash, in the book of Bamidbar, extended stories about the daughters of Tzulafchad. And in that context, we have all kinds of rules of inheritance. But inheritance is not mentioned at all in Parshat Mishpatim, from which we have to, these are two examples, and there are many other examples, obviously. None of these codes are complete in and of themselves. So that raises the question, what is this actually about? Is the idea that no one of them is complete, but put together, if you put all three codes together, you have a fairly complete or a more complete rule book. Now, of course, the rabbinic move is to try to take these different codes and from them somehow to develop a full-fledged rule book, full-fledged code book. That is the rabbinic move. And that's something that's very interesting. We'll try to deal with that as well, about how did the rabbis, or what are the rabbis doing, in fact, when they're reading these particular verses, and somehow from these verses creating a system of law, and not just particular rules, but if we get a chance this week or next, sort of principles of law, very fundamental principles of law, which they claim emerge from the verses. And I'll pick one example later on, either today or next week, and discuss it and show that actually how it really raises some very serious questions about how the rabbis are reading these texts. In any event, coming back to our point over here, so we have these incomplete codes. And then the question, one of the questions, which I raised already last time, and I want to come back to right now, is we have three different codes. I cited three examples, one in Shemot, one in Vayikra, one in Devarim. And the question is, these codes are not complete. But the question is, what is the relationship between the narrative and these codes of law? So I just want to take a few moments to just reflect upon that together with you, and then I'll stop and take any comments or questions. It's a pretty basic question. As I said, the Chumash is largely a story. But embedded in it, there are certain codes of law. Now, there are a couple of examples, I'll cite a couple of examples, where it's clear that the narrative and the code of law are deeply connected to each other. There are certainly four stories that jump to mind where the narrative is related to the law that follows, or the law that's related to it. And they all, interestingly enough, are in the book of Bamidbar, the book that we are presently reading in the yearly cycle of readings. And in fact, yesterday we came across one of them. Yesterday we read the story of Pesach Sheni. There were a group of people. Israel was commanded to bring the Korban Pesach, the sacrifice. And as we know, somebody who was ritually impure, whose tummy is not permitted to eat the sacrifice. And when it comes to the Korban Pesach, unlike other sacrifices, the eating is an essential part of bringing the sacrifice. In most sacrifices, you can bring the sacrifice, and if you can't eat it, okay, you didn't fulfill that element, but the sacrifice is kosher. It's a valid sacrifice. Korban Pesach is different. There, the Torah emphasizes the eating. So there were people that came, says the Torah, in chapter 9 of the book of Bamidbar. We read it yesterday. And they said, "Anachnu tmeim nefesh adam." We are ritually impure. However, why should we be deprived of bringing the sacrifice amongst all the people? And the point is that one could have said to them, what kind of question is this? You answered your own question. You said you're ritually impure. You can't eat it. So therefore, you can't eat it. What's your question? But their question was, apparently, that this is not just a normal sacrifice. The Korban Pesach was a sacrifice, was an event that defined this people as a Jewish people. It's the formation of the Jewish people. We are Jews. Therefore, we have to be included in this ritual. And Moshe does not dismiss what they say. Moshe says, let me see what God has to say about this. And Moshe brings their case to God, and God gives a response. And what is the response? The response is not just about these particular people. That's what's interesting. The response is to formulate a new law for Pesach Sheni, and that is that if people could not bring the sacrifice, Korban Pesach, in the first month, the month of Nisan, then they have an opportunity to bring the Korban Pesach a month later, what the Torah calls Pesach Sheni. And the Torah gives rules. In other words, you have a new law, but the new law is a function of the story. One could ask the question, what if they had not approached Moshe in the first place? Would we have such a law? It's a very interesting question. But de facto, the law is a function of the. So here we have an example of a narrative, and the narrative is related to the formulation of a new set of laws. Actually, interesting. Yesterday, somebody asked me the question. The story of the Korban Pesach, just as an aside, someone said the story begins with Vayhi Anoshim Asher Hayu Tmeim Nefesh Adam. There were people who were ritually impure. They'd come in contact with a corpse. And the person asked me the question, why does it say Vayihi, the singular? Should have said Vayihiyu. There were people. There wasn't just one person. It says Anoshim. And they approached Vayikrevu. So why does it say Vayihi in the singular? So I suggested that perhaps the Vayihi is often used. The Vayiyu would be just responding to their story. There were such people. But the Torah wants to say something different. And Vayihi often introduces a whole new, a significant piece of information, something that has lasting, enduring value. And the point that Vayihi is, the Torah is saying it's not just about these people. These people were the cause, but what it's really about is something of great significance, this idea of Pesach Sheni, not just that it's enshrined forever, but the whole idea of the Pesach Sheni is very striking. The idea that you have a second opportunity, a second chance, the idea of tashlumim, that's something that is relevant not just to Pesach Sheni, it's relevant to some other laws, and it's relevant to a way of thinking about oneself and about one's opportunities. So that's an example. Then, of course, we have the other story, which has parallel language in the book of Bamidbar, stories of Tzlafchad's daughters. And the point of Tzlafchad's daughters is this. I want to make an additional point about Bnot Tzlafchad. The first one is chapter 9 of Bamidbar, the next one is chapter 27 of Bamidbar. You can look it up yourself. It's a well-known story. They came to Moshe, 5 daughters of Tzlafchad. Our father died, and he wasn't in rebellion of Korach. He wasn't a rebel. He died. He died for other reasons. And now you're dividing up the land, and our father's portion will be lost because he has only daughters, and the presumption is that daughters do not inherit. Seems to be the case. When there are sons, daughters don't inherit in the Torah. And again, why should our father's portion be lost? Why should he be deprived of his portion? That is to say, if he has no inheritors, then his brothers will inherit his portion. But he has children. They happen to be daughters and not sons. And Moshe is very sympathetic to them, and Moshe advances their case before God. And there too, the response is not just to these particular 5 women, but it's a kind of halachic response. A new law is formulated in general. The laws of inheritance are mentioned, and when there are no sons, the daughters inherit. So that's another example where people came forward with a question, with a problem, seemed to have a valid point. Moshe takes their part, actually. Moshe advances their case, and the law is given. So there, obviously, the narrative and the law are deeply related. What's interesting is that the daughters of Tzulafchad come up again in the book of Bamidbar, actually in the last chapter. In the very last chapter of the book, chapter 36 of Bamidbar, the last chapter, the last story, that's how the book ends. The tribe of Menashe comes to Moshe, and they say to Moshe, look, you're giving the daughters of Tzulafchad their father's portion, which is all fine and good. That was what God told you to do. But we have a concern. Our concern is that when the daughters of Tzulafchad marry, and they marry from a different tribe, the presumption is that their land, their property, will pass over into the jurisdiction of their husbands, and therefore those parcels of land will be lost to the tribe. That's not right, they say. We don't want our tribe to lose land. That's what they advance. And the response is the following. The response is, on one hand, they should get the property. On the other hand, in such a situation, they have to marry members of their own tribe. They can't marry from a different tribe, and this way the land will remain in the province of their tribe, which is Menashe. Now, I'm not going to get into all the details of that story right now. It is the last story of the book of Bamidbar, which is very striking. But here's what's very interesting about this, and this touches on a different question I'd like at least to deal with to some extent. These are big questions. The Torah is explicit that in the case where a woman inherits from her father, inherits property, she's not permitted to marry somebody from a different tribe. But the rabbis step in and say, that is true of that generation. That is not true beyond the generation. So there we have a kind of rabbinic move. It's very interesting to limit the story of Bnot Tzulafchad, the marriage, to the one generation. And this really raises an interesting question. In other words, whatever is driving that, one could say, I think, that it disturbed the rabbis to think that we're limiting in this case, limiting the possibility of marriage to their one tribe. So they say that was a particular ruling just for that one generation. But it does raise the interesting question about the rabbinic reading of these stories and of these rules, and the limitations they place upon them, or the additional laws that they derive from extra letters, from all kinds of ways of deriving the 13 midot, etc. And it really raises the question for those who are studying the Chumash, as we are, is that what the Torah actually says? And what is motivating them, etc., etc., those kinds of questions. And what's interesting is I want to deal with this at some point at some of the most basic ideas that we have about the way law is supposed to work, which the Talmud claims is rooted in the Chumash. When you look at the Chumash, you sort of scratch your head and say, is that what it says? So I think that's a very useful and important project. We just touch upon it. Obviously, it's a whole big project to look at a whole bunch of laws, and then to try to draw some conclusions about the rabbinic understanding of these texts and how they see themselves as interpreters. I'll mention one other case where you have the narrative and the law connected, which is also very interesting, and also, for whatever reason, also from the book of Bamidbar. And this is perhaps a little less well known. The first three cases are well known, and not are they well known only. They have, when we're studying Bamidbar, we would notice the parallel language of each case. Each of those first three cases has common language. So the Chumash is saying you have to look at these cases, they come together. So there is actually one other case in the book of Bamidbar, and I just mentioned it now. It's all the way of introduction to our subject this morning. So towards the end of the book of Bamidbar, there's the story of Baal Pa'ar, that Israel gets engaged in the worship of Baal Pa'ar, an idolatrous worship. And the Midianites and the Moabites were involved. The Midianites, God instructs Moshe in chapter 31 to go to war against Midian. There's a whole long chapter about the war against the Midianites. not getting into it. It's one of the more disturbing chapters of the Bible, I would say, but leave it out for now. That's not our problem. In any event, they collect all kinds of booty and spoils. They divide it up amongst the soldiers and amongst the people. They devote some to the temple. Towards the end of that story, let me see if I can find this now. Yes, not the end. After the war, to chapter 31 of the book of Bamidbar, there's a whole bunch of rules over there that Moshe tells the people after the war, such as whoever came into contact with the dead body is tamei for 7 days. Okay, that's not that surprising, right? And then Elazar HaKohen says the following: Zot chukat haTorah. This is the law which God has commanded Moshe. Achet hazahav v'et hakesef et hanechoshet habarzel b'dion ofaret kol davar asher yavo ba'esh taviru ba'esh v'taher. So all these different things that you've taken, the articles that you've taken from the war, the silver and the copper and the iron and the lead, and the tin, you shall pass them through fire and they shall be clean, except that they must be cleansed with water. Something that cannot withstand fire, you must pass through water. Now, what is this rule? There's a new law that comes out of this war. And it's very unclear what the law is about. What it sounds like is what we call Hagalat Kelim. Something, for example, is not kosher. How do you make the pot kosher? So the rule is kibolo kach poto. If it was something that you cooked in fire, then you put it in fire to remove the impurities, to remove that which is not kosher, and then you can use the pot, right? We're familiar with that. That's one rule. And there's another rule, which is if you buy a new vessel from a non-Jew, you take it and you have to be told of the vessel. Tfilat Kelim. It's very unclear when you read the Chumash which of these rules is the Torah referring to. It sounds like, actually, I mean, from one hand, these were vessels they took from the war. On the other hand, what's being described is what we would call Hagala, basically. But either way, whatever one it is, here we have an example. This is a new law. It was never mentioned before. And here we have a new law, also in the book of Bamidbar, that seems to be directly related to what takes place. The difference is that in the first 3 cases, someone actually asks the question. Someone comes forward, whether it's Salafchad's daughters, or whether it's the tribe of Menashe, or whether it's the people in Pesach Sheni, they ask the question. And one can say, if they hadn't asked the question, what would have happened? In this case, no one's asking any questions. The Elazar HaKohen tells the people what God has instructed Moshe concerning these vessels. In any event, I mention all of this because it touches upon a very important question, namely the relationship of the narrative to the codes of law. There is a second question, by the way, which we've touched upon several times in the past, and that is not so much about the relationship between them, but about which of these is more central to the Chumash. Is the Chumash basically a bunch of stories, or is the Chumash basically a bunch of laws? And Rashi is clear. Rashi says the Chumash fundamentally is a bunch of laws. That's Rashi's position throughout. And others, the Ramban, disagrees. Laws are important, but that's not the whole story. That's a whole other conversation. Now, I mentioned all of this by way of introduction once again to Parshat Mishpatim. And I want to come back to what I had mentioned in one of the previous sessions when we started looking at these laws. And before I do that, though, I want to stop for a moment. And if there are any comments or questions till now, please speak up.
So far, no new questions in chat, although thank you, Deborah, for being right on the money about some of the stuff that was going to come up. But if you have questions, please feel free to unmute.
Excuse me, Rabbi, this is Sandra. So on the issue of laws versus stories, Rabbi Luxing was giving a shir once. I mean, it must be 20 plus years ago, and he quoted Rabbi Soloveitchik, whom he had actually taken a weekly parsha shir with 1.5 million years ago, and he quoted him, and he was very adamant about it, saying that Rabbi Soloveitchik had said that as a contrarian kind of response to people saying, what do you need the stories of Bereshit for? They're nice little kid stories. They don't tell us laws. They don't tell us everything. And he actually came out adamantly on the Ramban side that you just alluded to, saying absolutely the opposite, saying that the stories, for instance, these seemingly benign or maybe for children only stories in Bereshit, for instance, were actually critically important because in tandem with the portions of the Torah that say these are the laws of X, we learn laws, said Rabbi Luxing, said Rabbi Soloveitchik. We learn laws directly from these stories. We learn laws of how to behave. And as you alluded to just a few minutes ago, laws of inheritance, laws of how to treat our children, laws of what to do and what not to do. So I just wanted to offer that sort of as a three generations removed from Rabbi Soloveitchik's coming down on that exact issue and saying, no, the stories do tell us and teach us laws.
Oh, I agree with that completely. I would go beyond that, though. Something that Rabbi Soloveitchik probably would not say, but I'll say it, which is that actually there's something problematic about law in general. It's not something you would ever say publicly, but what's problematic about law, among other things, is, and why law is really insufficient, given it, is that there's one law for everybody. There's one rule. You have a set of rules. You apply the rules, for the most part, equally. But we know that that's actually not what life is about. In other words, two people can do the identical thing, but it doesn't actually mean the same thing. Because for one of those people, it's reflective of one thing. For someone else, it's reflective of something else. The circumstances are never the same. And the question is, the law can only take that into account to some extent. For the most part, laws are laws for everyone. But when you have stories, that's very different. The power of the story is you come to recognize that it's not that certain things aren't just wrong. They are. But they're not wrong in the same way. And the point of the story and the power of stories is you're looking at it from the standpoint of a particular situation, a particular person, or a particular set of people. And therefore, these stories are more than complementary to the law. I think they're really basic. I think that, different people, I think when the word of Hasidut, they saw these stories that some of the Hasidic masters. But Nachman writes stories because he understands that the power of the story. So of course that's true, and there's plenty to learn from the behavior of the various characters, heroes, etc., in the Book of Bereshit, also from their mistakes. But yeah, for sure, I agree with that. I just would go beyond it and say that something about the stories which are so true, which is they are very individual, and that's where the law is at its weakest, because it just has one rule. Okay, in any event, so that's one issue in terms of Rashi, the Ramban, etc. But then there is the other question of the relationship between the narrative on one hand and the law. And I did want to add one point which I didn't emphasize sufficiently in the previous set of sessions, and that is that first of all, you see from these set of laws, mishpatim, that the first extended laws, once you get beyond not to make molten gods, etc. But Eila Mishpatim is by far and away the longest section in these laws, and they deal with slavery. I'm not going to go over again what they do with slavery. They certainly limit it. They maybe transform slavery of the woman into marriage, but it's the first set of laws and it's the longest set of laws. And that makes perfect sense in a book which is all about leaving slavery, becoming God's servants, one could say, instead of Pharaoh's servants. And the 10 Commandments themselves begin, I am the God who took you out of Egypt from the house of slavery. So it makes perfect sense that in this particular set of laws, unlike the ones in Vayikra, unlike the ones in Dvarim, it starts with slavery. That makes total sense, and it suggests to us, in the strongest possible way, that the laws of Sefer Shemot and the narrative of Sefer Shemot are actually tied together. I mentioned that last time, but I want to add something to that, which I think is a very important point about the laws in Parshat Mishpatim. Already, the Ibn Ezra already is wondering whether there is some central idea that permeates many of the laws that we encounter in the book of in Mishpatim. And I wanted to, in that spirit, I wanted to point out the following: that when we talk about the book of Exodus, about freedom from slavery, we study this together. And one of the main points that I made when we started the book of Shemot is that the story of the Exodus from Egypt, the freedom from slavery, is not just about freedom from slavery, but it is a fulfillment of a prior covenant that God makes with Abraham back in chapter 15 of Bereshit. And that covenant, called the Brit Ben Habatarim, that God made with Abraham in chapter 15, in that God promises Abraham descendants, and God promises Abraham that they will possess this land. And Abraham said to Hashem in chapter 15, as we all remember, Hashem Elokim b'mo'edah ki'iru Hashena, which we interpreted to mean not how do I know it's going to happen, but b'mo'edah, through what will I know? In other words, if we're talking about a covenant, and the Torah called that a covenant, Brit Ben Habatarim, Karat Hashem Brit, a covenant involves two sides. It involves commitments on both sides. Avram says to God, what is our commitment? B'mo'edah, through what shall I know? And God's response is, Yadoah Teda, you will certainly know. Ki yeh zaracha b'eretz lo lahem, and your descendants will be strangers in a foreign land, not theirs. V'avadum, they will be enslaved. V'inu otam, they'll be abused for many years. In other words, there is a price to be paid. There's a commitment to be made. And as we've spoken about this countless times, Gerut, Avdut, and Inui. Now that triad, Gerut, Avdut, and Inui, it appears several times in the Torah. It appears in Exodus, in Bereshit chapter 15. It appears in Bereshit chapter 16 with Hagar, the Ger, who is also a Shivcha, she's an Eved, she's a slave. And Sarai, Vatanea Sarai, she has Inui. So we have the three of them in conjunction with Hagar. And what that means and how it plays out is not our topic. But there you have it. You have the three of them, Gerut, Avdut, and Inui, in the beginning of Sefer Shemot. In chapter 1, you have Inui and Avdut. And then in chapter 2, we have the birth of Gershom. So we have Inui, Avdut, and Gerut in that story. We have Inui, Avdut, and Gerut in chapter 31 of Sefer Bereshit, when Yaakov, and chapter 32, when Yaakov, speaking to Lavan, describes his 20 years in the house of Lavan as Avdut, slavery, and as Inui, Onyi. And then in chapter 32, Jacob says, Im Lavan Garti. So we have Gerut, Avdut, and Inui there as well. Now that's 4. We have Gerut, Avdut, and Inui in a parsha that we read at the Seder. That comes from the end of Sefer Devarim, Arami Oved Avi. Here we have Gerut, Avdut, and Inui. Arami Oved Avi Vayered Mitzrayma Vayagar Sham Bimseimot Vayagar. We were Gerim. That's Gerut. Next verse, Vayareim Otanu HaMitzrim Vayaanunu Inui. Vayinu Aleinu Avodah Kasha Avdut. So we have 5 different places in the Torah where Gerut, Avdut, and Inui come together. 3 times in Sefer Bereshit, once in the beginning of Sefer Shemot, describing the experience in Egypt, and finally, Arami Oved Avi, that we read at the Seder, we recall our history. Now, those are the 5 times they come together, but there is a 6th time. And the 6th time, they don't come exactly together, but they come within the same section. And the section that they come together in is Sefer HaBrit, the book of the covenant of the book of Shemot, or in our lingo, Parshat Mishpatim. So Avdut, we noticed right away when God begins to Ela Mishpatim Asher Tosim Lifneihem. These are the Mishpatim Yeshua placed before them. So it starts with Avdut, and by far and away the longest section is about slavery. And the slave is not a slave forever. The slave is freed after 6 years. And for the woman, she's not even really a slave. So there's a great limitation. There's not a rejection of slavery totally, but there's certainly a limitation. And I already spoke about that at length in the past. I'm not going over that. That's how it starts. That's Avdut. Now, what about Gerut and Inui? What about the other two components? Are they mentioned in this section of Mishpatim, in this Brit, Sefer HaBrit? And the answer is a resounding yes, they are mentioned. And the fact that they're mentioned itself would not necessarily be that significant. But there's something about the way they're mentioned which is significant. Let's first start with Gerut, being a ger. Being a ger means being part of a community, but you're not really part of the community. You're somewhat of an outsider. You dwell there, perhaps on a temporary basis or a hoped-for temporary basis, but you're treated as an outsider, as the other, maybe even as a danger. So what does the Chumash say in this book of the covenant, the Mishpatim? What does the Chumash tell us about a ger? So here there's something interesting about the ger, and that is that the Torah in Parshat Mishpatim mentions the ger. Let's find these verses. Let's find these verses. 1 second. Okay, so one verse is, there's a verse in chapter 23, verse number 9. Chapter 23, verse number 9. Just hold on 1 second. Let's begin first with chapter 22. Chapter 22, verse number 20. Chapter 22, verse number 20 says the following, 22:20. V'ger lo toneh v'lo tilchatzenu, ki gerim hayitem b'eretz Mitzrayim. You shall not toneh, harm or wrong a stranger, or tilchatzenu, oppress or pressure. That's chapter 22, verse number 20. So we are forbidden to oppress, to pressure, or to oppress the ger. And the Torah gives us a reason. Ki gerim hayitem b'eretz Mitzrayim. You were gerim, you were strangers in the land of Egypt. Now, the question is, what does that mean? That you were strangers in the land of Egypt, and therefore do not oppress the stranger, do not mistreat the stranger. So Rashi comments that what it means is, says Rashi, don't think you're better than they are. I'm a real citizen. They're just immigrants. And the Torah says, what do you think you are? You're also a ger. You were a ger too. So don't look down upon the other person as being inferior to you when you're in the same boat, you know? That's Rashi's take on it. Ger lo toneh, this explicitly, you shouldn't be oneh anybody, actually. You shouldn't be malchitz anybody, but specifically the ger. And don't think you're better, says Rashi. The ger is the same as you. There's no difference. Fine, I understand that. Fine. But what's very striking is that's chapter 22, verse number 20. But then you get to chapter 23, verse number 9. And suddenly, this is the strangest thing. V'ger lo tilchatz, chapter 23, verse number 9. It Torah repeats it. V'ger lo tilchatz, you shall not pressure or oppress the ger. Torah already said that. The Torah said earlier, V'ger lo toneh v'lo tilchatzenu, ki gerim hayitem b'eretz Mitzrayim. And over here, again, V'ger lo tilchatz, and here the Torah gives a different reason, apparently. V'atem yidatem et nefesh hager, ki gerim hayitem b'eretz Mitzrayim. You know you know the feelings of the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. In other words, it's not just you're not better. Rashi said you're not better. But this verse is not saying you're not better. It's saying something very different. You should understand specifically the feeling of the ger. You know what it means to be an outsider, because you were outsiders. And therefore, the Torah says we impose upon you an additional, you should be more sensitive to the suffering of the ger, because you know exactly what it is. Maybe someone else doesn't think it's so bad, but you know what it feels like to be a ger. And my point is that in this little kodo, in this little law book, the last thing you expect in a law book is that the same law is actually repeated in two different places and two different reasons are given. And that's very striking. The fact that it's repeated means that the Torah singles it out. And in fact, notice that in each case, it doesn't just talk about don't do X, but it mentions in each case specifically the experience of being in the land of Egypt. I mean, one could actually go even beyond this and make the following observation. Because one of the questions that any student of the Chumash asks when you're studying Bereshit, and God says to Abraham, you know, when Abraham says, what is the cost? What is the price? What is that commitment? And the Torah says, Geirut Avdat Aninu. They'll have to be enslaved, they'll have to be strangers, they'll have to be oppressed. And the reader asks the question, why? Why is that? What kind of why? Why do you have to go through Geirut and Avdat and Inui to enter into God's covenant? What does it have to do with you have an heir and you're going to possess a land? But one way to understand this is that what the Torah is saying, what Hashem says to Avram is, you're going to possess your own land. When you possess your own land, you're going to set up your own system of justice. You're going to set up your own rules, your own conventions, your own rules. And here's what you set up your system. Here's what you have to understand. Don't set up a system like the one you yourself experienced in the land of Egypt. Because the land of Egypt was a place where you were the outsider. And make sure when you set up your land, that people in your land, understand that they're going to be treated fairly. Whether they are full-fledged citizens, Ezrachim, or whether they ger, or whatever, it makes no difference. In other words, that could be an explanation, an interpretation of why, in the first place, these are the conditions for forming a nation. So here you have it pretty clearly. So it starts with Avdut, and we have the ger, which is mentioned twice, and the reason given twice, and each time the reason is connected to the experience of being in the land of Egypt. That's when it comes to Geirut. So we have Geirut and we have Avdut. All that remains is the third condition of Inui. So will Inui be mentioned in this code of law? And lo and behold, it is mentioned. But what's very striking is the way it's mentioned. And that is, it's mentioned again in chapter 22. Right after you have the ger. Ger is chapter 22, verse number 20. And then we have chapter 22, verse number 21, and begins with, and it's called Almana v'yatom lo ta'anun. You shall not oppress the widow and the orphan. Okay, that's the rule. Understand that. That's the rule. That's chapter 22, verse number 21. But then the Torah continues. Im ano ta'aneh oto. For if in fact you will be ma'aneh, notice the double language. If you do it, if they cry out to me, notice again the double tza'ak, tza'ok tza'ak. Shamoa eshma tza'akato, again the double. I will certainly hear their cry. V'charapi, and I will become angry, says God. V'arakti etchem b'charev, and I will kill you by the sword. V'yu nishechem almanot, your wives will be widows and your children will be orphans. Now, there's something quite remarkable about these verses. And what is remarkable about them, the point I made in the past several times, I repeat it, you don't expect this in a code of law. A code of law is very dispassionate. There's a bunch of rules. And the lawgiver presents it in a very dispassionate way. these are the rules. This is what you got to do. But over here, suddenly, God gets angry. I would say furious. The double language, ano taneh, tzok yitzak, shamoa eshma, and then I will kill you, and your wives will be widows, and your children will be orphans. So you see the degree to which the inui is something that actually disturbs God in the deepest way. And in fact, what's interesting is that we have Gerut, Avdut, and Inui, of course, in the very beginning of this book, because they are the covenantal conditions. But what's striking is that when God speaks to Moshe about freeing the people, and the Torah speaks about God freeing the people from slavery, and Moshe is told to bring the message back to the people, which he finally agrees to do after many conversations. Moshe goes to the people, and he tells the people what God had told him. And the Torah says in the last verse of chapter 4, I'll read it to you. And the people believed. Ki pakad Hashem et bnei Yisrael. The people believed that God would redeem Israel. V'chi ra'ah et on Yom, and that God saw on Yom. God saw their plight, their suffering. Vayitu vayishtachavu. So what the Torah singled out, what Moshe tells the people, what God sees on Yom, God sees the suffering. And in fact, if you go back to the story of the burning bush, the first thing God says to Moshe, after the preliminaries, take off your shoes, don't take too close. I'm the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Vayomer Hashem, in chapter 3, the burning bush, first verse. Ra'o ra'iti et oni ami asher b'Mitzrayim. Notice the double. Ra'o ra'iti, once again, I certainly have seen. When it comes to Inui, we have all this double language. Ra'o ra'iti, shamoa eshma, sa'ok yitzak. What has God seen? Oni ami asher b'Mitzrayim. So here we have, here's my point. I mentioned there are 5 places in the Torah where Gerut, Avdut, and Inui come together. By the way, there's an additional shear I could give about the order of these 3 things. They're not always in the same order, which is also very interesting. Once you see the 5 of them come together. But I claim they come together in the 6th place, which is the Book of the Covenant. They don't come together in the same way. They're written one after the next. That doesn't exist. But they come together in the sense that they are highlighted. One is highlighted by being in the very beginning and being the longest. That's Avdut. One is highlighted through repetition. That's when it comes to Ger. Ger lo tuchatz, lo toner, lo tuchatzenu. Highlighted, mentioned twice, and different reasons given for it, and each one connected to Mitzrayim. And then you have the Inui. The Inui is highlighted by this lawgiver suddenly losing God's temper, basically, and saying, if you do this, I'm going to get you, and your own wives will be widows, and your kids will be orphans. You better not do that, because that's going to infuriate me. I'm going to get angry. It doesn't mention any anger any other place. The Inui is what angers God. So therefore, I think it's fair to say, in terms of the question, what is the relationship between this code of law and the narrative? And the answer is, there's a deep connection, because it connects to the very idea of leaving Mitzrayim, which is becoming a nation, which is part of the covenant, becoming God's people. And these set of laws are called Sefer HaBrit. They are called the Book of the Covenant, which lends further, I think, strength to the point that I'm making about the connection between Mishpatim and the narrative that precedes it. Okay, let me stop at this point to take any comments or questions, and then we'll move on briefly to the next topic, start at least the next topic. Are there any comments or questions?
No comments in chat, but people
No
are very
comments.
welcome to unmute
Everybody
and
agrees
ask.
with what I said. Okay, it's unanimous. That's right. All right. I think that's very interesting. It's not that obvious. In other words, the other cases of Gerut, Avdut, and Inui, they come together. And once you recognize that, you look for it, you'll find it in most interesting ways in 5 different stories. You find it with Jacob, describes his experience in the house of love and his Gerut, Avdut, and Inui, and you have it with the Torah's description of Israel and Egypt. Those two scenarios are parallel scenarios, right? That's what the Passover Haggadah picked up. See what our beloved tried to do to our father Jacob, right? That's the first thing. Pharaoh only decreed against the boys, the males, but Lovin would have destroyed everything. That's how you begin the medrash of the Haggadah. It's the strangest medrash possible. On the night of Passover, night of the Exodus from Egypt, the first thing we say is, you think Pharaoh was bad? Lovin was 10 times worse. What? We're talking about the Exodus from Egypt. Why are we saying that in the beginning of the drashot? Say Lamad, go and learn, go forth and learn. It's the name of my Haggadah, Say Lamad. But of course, the point is because the experience of how Jacob and the experience of Israel and Egypt are the same experience. That's what I got to understand. Because the same language describes them both. The Gerut, Avdit, and Inui. It's not that they're two different experiences. It's that same experience. It's not about history. The Haggadah makes the claim that could happen again. It will happen again, not just in these two places, not just on the level of family and nation. It can happen throughout history. Chodar Vadar, it could happen anytime. There are always bad people out there who want to subject us to Gerut, Avdit, and Inui. So the Haggadah already picked it up, but they're the terms of one after the other. I mean, they're separated by a chapter over there in Love and Garti, but fundamentally they come together. But in the book of the covenant, it's less obvious. So that's the claim. Okay, so no questions. Move on to the next topic.
Comment.
Yes.
So the whole religion, I'd say, the whole religion and the whole book of laws is based on the idea of compassion. It's the recognition of we are individuals who suffer in this world many times, and we should have compassion.
Well, I wouldn't say the whole religion is based on that. I don't like to reduce a religion to one or two principles, but I would say there's no question that, compassion, I would say, for the Chumash, I would say it's not just about compassion, it's also about equity. It's what is right. It's living by God's rules. And the same way God is concerned about the widow, the orphan, fairness, equity, I think it's about creating a society which takes into account people's situations. I don't think it's fair to say that law is not part of the law has to be a fair law. I mean, and that's the question. To what extent? There's a verse that says, "Do not favor the poor person in injustice." Someone is a black and white wrong, poor or not poor. The truth is very central. But it's certainly the case that law deeply connected to and based upon compassion and kindness. I think that's fair to say. The degree, people can disagree to what extent one is more central to the other, but I think you can make a very strong case, as you suggest, that this, that the Inui and the fact of the matter is, our story is the thing we remember all the time. Strikingly enough, is the fact that we were slaves in Egypt and God freed us from Egypt. It comes up in the Chumash a million times. So that is the main thing we have to remember. Remember, you were slaves in Mitzrayim, which is very striking. It's not remember that you conquered the land. Chumash doesn't really emphasize that. The Chumash emphasizes, and the tradition emphasizes, about being slaves in Mitzrayim and being freed. And it's part of that is gratitude towards the God who freed us, and part of that is to remember that people can be subject to all kinds of circumstances beyond their control. And when you see somebody in the street begging on a corner, you have to understand that easily could have been you. That's just the reality of it. So that's a very important point. And again, within this tradition, there are many different positions about the degree to which, et cetera, but I think overall your point is well taken. Certainly here it's very central. This covenant of Gerut, Avdit, and Inui, of God redeeming us and teaching us what it means to be on the other side of things. I think that's a very important point. Okay.
David?
Yes.
David, I was going to say the point that Laszlo made, because if it was just to give us the laws, then we didn't need the Gerus, Avdus, and Inui. I think that the idea behind it is to make us always remember the other. And the best way to do that is to teach us what it was to feel like the other. And then you can put on top of that the laws and being just and a just society. But it's more of an abstract if it's just Hashem giving us the laws and it's a just society. It hits home much more if we were on the other side first.
I agree, but I would let me just say one more point about this idea that why I feel it's so important to grasp this idea. How I began, that the laws are come out of, certainly in the narratives in Bamidbar, they come out of the human experience. And I'll just make one point over here, which is I guess a big point to think about, agree or disagree. But I grew up basically. I mean, my first two Rebbes, basically, who I owe a great debt to, were Rabbi Aaron Lichtenstein and Rabbi Soloveitchik. Those are my two Rebbes. I didn't have any other Rebbes, basically. No formal Rebbes. I had many people that taught me things, and Rabbi Soloveitchik put out there his take on law. It's kind of this kind of Platonic law, which he writes. I mean, he may have changed his mind to some extent later in life, but he writes about halachic man. He talks about a set of laws that are up there in heaven, kind of Platonic law. And we're trying to figure out what actually this Platonic law is about, but it has its source above. And you try to understand what this Platonic law is about. That's how law begins. Law begins from above. And that's how I was brought up. And then many years afterwards, not so many years afterwards, I actually went to the Carlebach Shul. And there I had a different feeling, which I picked up from a variety of people. And not so much Shlomo Carlebach directly, although indirectly, certainly. I didn't have a connection to him personally, but there had a different sense of what this tradition is about, which is coming out of the Hasidic world, which is into radical Hasidus, which is it doesn't begin with what's up in heaven. It begins with the human condition, and the idea of law is to give us a pathway to play out our best moral selves. That's my understanding of what they're actually saying, and that's a position that I basically believe. Actually, having said all that, I don't believe in this Torah Hashemayim business. I believe that it starts with the human condition, and therefore, I think that one way to read the Chumash is exactly that. That it's, the Torah gives us a way. You want to be a compassionate person. Okay, that's very lovely. And the question is, so what are you doing about that? Torah is a bunch of laws, Pidyon Shvuyim, Gemilos Chasadim, Tzedakah, etc. The way you treat the other person, etc. And the law is, the halacha is, it says halacha, it's a way of living in which you are actually, playing out your best moral self. So that's the reason this to me is so important. I basically rejected this other idea that it's somehow this Platonic halacha. That's a much larger question, but in any event, just to make a personal statement, why I think this is so interesting is because you do see that the law is responding to human need, to human, and valid human need. Now, when it's not valid, the law doesn't respond. When B'nai Gad and B'nai Reuven in the book about Midbar say, we don't want to cross the Jordan because we have a lot of cattle, let the others go fight. And Moshe says, well, they're fighting and you're not going to fight? They go to war and you just get the benefits without participating? Nobody, makes it as a rhetorical statement. It's a rhetorical question. That's so crazy. Nobody could ever think such a crazy idea. If other people are going to fight and you don't fight, who would ever dream of? Moshe says it's a rhetorical question. So the point is they want to do their own thing, and Moshe says, I'm very sorry. That's not the way it works. That's not right. That's an abdication of responsibility. So it's not always what people want is what they get. But if it's in line with the values that the Torah puts out there, that's another story. So I do think that this idea of the narrative being connected to the law, our experience in Mitzrayim, and that and learning from our experience, what it means to be on the other side of things, that I think is very, very central. And to me, that's basically what halachas should be about. I know that sometimes it seems that it's not quite about that, but that's I think what it should be about. All right. Anyway, that's what I just issue I just raised now is a big issue, I think, for philosophy of halacha, how one sees all these rules and laws. I put in my 2 cents. But in any event, what the Chumash is saying here, as far as the connection between the covenantal formula and the Sefer HaBrit, I think is, to me, is a strong, I think it's a strong case to be made over here about gay with applicant.
Rabbi,
Yes.
you expounded as to Rabbi Soloveitchik's position. So how does Rabbi Lichtenstein's position differ from this, or what you took from it?
It's a very, very good question. You know, I think it's very hard to know. He was very interesting. And I mean, I've been reading a lot of Rabbi Lichtenstein lately. His 10th yard site was, and someone I owe a lot to personally. And he also, I was in his shiur. It really changed my life in terms of how to approach things. I mean, he had many wonderful qualities, and he was, when you look, he's just when you read his stuff, he's just a bit much bigger person. He's just big. He's a big person. Well, you could agree or disagree with some of his very conservative side to him, but he's just a big man. And when he left Yeshiva University and flew to Israel, I'm not saying right, not my business to say right, wrong, whatever. And wherever he is, he made big contributions. But his leaving Yeshiva University was a devastating blow to Yeshiva University. There's no question about that. But he packed his bags, got on an airplane. He's just a much bigger than the other people. Now, what's interesting about him was that one of the things he really focused on in his writings was the Ben Adam HaChavero. And he took a rather very extreme positions about the way one's responsibility to one's fellow human being. He wrote about that extensively in his manner of great mastery of the sources and conceptualizing it and presenting the different points of view. And he had his own point of view, but it's very clear that his point of view was that the halacha demands, in some cases, quite extreme behavior in being recognizing the needs of the other, not imposing on the other, etc. That's where he spent a lot of his energies, whether it's Kofan Amidat Sedom, Lifni Mishura Tadin. Those are the things he writes about. Some are in Hebrew, some are in English, and I suggest that it's very worthwhile to read them. And he also brings in other voices, not Jewish voices, which he actually respects, brings them in the most respectful way. Sometimes we'll say that's not our path, but he respects it. So he's just a big person. Now, where he stands about halacha in general, it's very hard to know what he thought about this, about this sort of Platonic Torah. I think to some extent he did accept it to some degree, but it's very hard to know with him because he didn't, when he writes about something, he goes through it very deeply, goes through the sources, etc. He did believe in it. He believed in adherence to halacha. He had a kind of simple faith about him, I would say. He had a simple faith. And whatever, I don't want to get, again, my own personal connection to him, but I have enormous respect, and certainly a big person. His stuff is worthwhile to read always, but I think one of his real concerns, where he spent a lot of time thinking and writing about, was exactly this point about one's responsibility to the other. And I would say his positions on that are pretty extreme in terms of responsibility. So that's where he stands. In terms of his overall theology, I don't remember him ever talking about that in those terms. Judaism and humanism, he talked about that to some extent, and he's always seeing both sides of every issue. That was his thing, seeing the totality of it. And then, once he determined that something is right, he took a position. Very often he presents two sides. And I would say one other thing about him, which is one of the things that he was very, very focused on, was trying to understand both sides of every argument. That's how he taught Talmud. There's a disagreement in the Gemara or in the Rishonim. You have to understand each side. It's important to understand the other side. Sometimes that can lead to not making a decision, picking one or the other. I don't think there are two sides to every issue, but his general approach was to try to understand every side. And on some things he took very strong positions. I don't know. A big person, great person, a very important teacher. And again, one can agree or disagree with some of the positions that he took. That's another conversation. But I don't know what he thought about this Platonic Torah. This I don't know, actually. Maybe others do know. I don't. I was in his shir for a couple of years and I read his stuff, but I can't answer that question. All right. We still have a few more minutes. So let me just at least begin by raising the following question, which is a pretty basic question about Torah Shebaal Peh. And that is, very simply put, what is the relationship between this idea of a kind of oral tradition, which is so central to Rabbinic Judaism, and what it actually says in the Chumash? I mean, and I think the question can be, when you read something like Mishpatim, the question is an obvious question. That's one question, that's an obvious question, which is the rabbis present us with certain understandings of halacha and certain principles. I want to begin with one of the main principles of halacha that appears in many, many areas of halacha. So that's the question I want to just put out there now, and maybe next week we'll start with that. The other question, which I raised explicitly and implicitly, which is also very interesting, which is, what is the relationship between what it says here in the Torah, these rules in the Torah, and other law codes of the ancient Near East that preceded it by hundreds, and in one case maybe 1,000 years, because there were all kinds of striking parallels between them. I would say, by the way, that's an area that Lichtenstein never ventured into. That was completely outside his. He never went there, and he rejected it basically. Any kind of criticism when it came to Torah Shebaal Peh, and of course biblical criticism, he rejected completely. So that's another issue, mentioning his name. But in any event, let me just begin by starting with one rabbinic principle that applies across the board in many areas, and that is the principle that the Gemara calls rov. Rov means a majority. Now, the idea that you follow the majority. Now, that comes across in the Talmud in many different places. But let me start with the simplest case, and then I'll just put it out there now, and next week we'll start with a discussion about rov. It comes up in the simplest case. The Gemara talks about a whole tractate, which talks about courts. Now, there are different kinds of courts. There's a court of 3 judges. There's a court of 23 judges. And there's a court of 70 or 71 judges. There actually are some other courts which have other numbers in them, etc., but let's leave that out. But the main 3 courts in the Mishnah are 3, 23, and 70 or 71. Now, these different courts deal with different things. So the court of 3, that deals basically with monetary matters. The court of 23 deals with capital offense, and perhaps other things such as malchot, etc. Capital, I suppose, not death sentence, but lashes, etc. And the court of 71, Sanhedrin, that deals with issues that between tribes, going to war, all kinds of things. There's not just a kind of judicial side to the court of 71. There's also a kind of formulating rules, formulating laws, etc. These are big topics. But there's a court of 3, a court of 23, and a court of 71, let's say. Let's talk about the court of 3. 2 people come to court, they're fighting about a monetary matter. So it goes before the judges. So the judges vote. So what is the rule? Suppose you have 2 judges say Reuven wins, and 1 judge say Shimon wins. What happens in that case? So the rule is we follow the rov, we follow the majority, and that's a fundamental principle about rov. And the Gemara asks the question, How do you know you follow the rove? Now, rove applies not only in legal matters. Could apply in the following case. You're walking in the street and you see 3 chickens. 2 of them are kosher and 1 is not kosher. And you don't know which is which. What do you do in that case? Are you permitted to take a chicken and to eat it? And the answer is you are permitted. Why? You follow the rove, the majority. Majority says 2 out of 3 chances is kosher. And therefore, you are permitted to take a chicken and to eat it. You're probably permitted to take 2 chickens and eat them. Whether you're permitted to eat all 3 chickens, that's already a dispute. But 2 you could certainly eat. Why? You follow the rove. The Gemara asked the question in Chulin, how do you know you follow majority? How do you know? The Gemara says, of course you know it. It's a pasuk in the Chumash. It's in the book of Exodus, chapter 23, verse number 2. It says, Lo tia acharei rabim l'raot, lo taneh al riv, u'intot acharei rabim l'hatot. That's the verse. Chapter 23, verse number 2. That's the verse we're going to start with next week. And when you read the verse, 2 things come to mind. First of all, what in the world does it actually say? It's a difficult verse to explain. What is this verse saying? And number 2, does it actually say you follow the majority? Is that what it says? That's what the Gemara claims. It says, Acharei Rabim Lahatot. It says explicitly, follow the majority. And we ask the question, oh, really? Is that what it says? I'm not sure it says that. In fact, it might even say exactly the opposite.
The opposite, right?
It might say exactly the opposite. Now, we will start with this next week as an example of, it's really, I have no answers here. I have questions. In other words, how is this rabbinic tradition, how does it see itself as relating to what the Torah says? So we'll start with that next week. So we have 2 more sessions. I just wanted to add, I added on 3 sessions because I felt there's so much more to say here. Not that we're going to cover everything, we will not, but I did want at least to have opportunity to read some of these psukim and to think about them. At the end of the day, the Torah is, whether it's the main thing as Rashi thinks or not, only thing, it is pretty central. These are codes of law that are very central to us. So we'll spend another couple of weeks looking at some of these rules. Okay, it's good to be with you. And okay, looking forward to next week. Hope we have good news. B'sarot tovot. We'll call Yisrael. And looking forward. Thank you for participating.
Thank you so much.
And Rabbi Silber, one last question from chat.
Yes.
This is from Stacy Lehman asking for any particular recommendations of writings from Rav Lichtenstein.
He has books, actually. He has books, but I can try to come in next week with some. If you Google Aaron Lichtenstein, Aharon Lichtenstein, you will see he has several books. One came out with a new book. There's one called Leaves of Faith. Some are more technical than others, but I mean, you get a sense of the person. If you read it, you get a sense of the person in terms of how he approaches things. It's extremely impressive, actually. Okay, we'll start next week with Rove. Thank you very much. Take care.
Take care, everyone. Bye.